40,000 Mongol warriors versus 10,000 samurai, and a storm that changed history. Before dawn on the 19th of October, 1281, the fishermen of Kyushu's northern coast would not go to the water. They had not gone to the water in weeks. They stood on the high ground behind the seawall, wrapped in robes against the autumn chill, their breath visible in the dark, and they looked out at Hakata Bay, and what they saw was not the sea. What sea? What they saw was a city that moved. More than 4,500 ships stretched from horizon to horizon, so dense that a man could walk from one shore to another if he were mad enough to try, stepping from deck to deck across the blackness of the water. Lanterns burned on every vessel. The bay itself seemed to breathe, rising and falling in slow swells, and in that half-light before the sun broke over the eastern mountains, the Mongol fleet looked less like an armada and more like a dark continent that had drifted in from the edge of the world. On those ships, 140,000 men, or perhaps more. The numbers blur across the centuries, but the scale does not. The largest seaborne invasion force the medieval world had ever assembled. Soldiers from the steppes of Mongolia who had never seen the ocean. Chinese conscripts from conquered provinces, men dragged from farming villages 1,000 miles away. Korean sailors whose homeland had already been crushed under Kublai Khan's boot, now pressed into service as the engine of his next conquest. They spoke perhaps a dozen languages. They worshipped different gods. They were held together by one thing alone, the will of the man who had already made himself master of the largest land empire in human history, and who did not understand the concept of a limit. Against them, on the shore behind that long stone wall, perhaps 10,000 samurai. Not 10,000 soldiers, not 10,000 men with spears or conscripted farmers. 10,000 samurai, warriors who had trained since childhood, who believed with every fiber of their being that to die with honor was the only death worth dying, who looked at that fleet and felt, if we are honest, something close to what we would call terror, and chose to stand anyway. The numbers made no rational sense. The logistics made no rational sense. The very attempt to defend Japan made no rational sense. But sense had nothing to do with it. This was not merely a battle about territory. The Mongols had already tested Japan once, 7 years earlier, and the message in that first invasion had been unmistakable: adapt or die. Japan had adapted. Japan had built walls. Japan had changed its entire way of war. And now, on this October morning, with the sky still dark and the wind beginning to shift in a way that the oldest priests recognized as something more than weather, the men on that shore were not just fighting for their island. They were fighting for the idea that Japan existed at all. This battle did not just save Japan. What happened in Hakata Bay in 1281 gave birth to something far more powerful than a military victory. It created a myth about wind, about heaven, about the idea that certain lands and certain peoples are protected by forces beyond the reach of any army. And that myth, built from real blood and real ships and a real storm, would echo with consequences no one on that shore could have imagined for 700 years. This is the story of the battle that was won before the last warrior died, and of how the winning of it planted the seed of a catastrophe centuries away. The world before the storm. To understand what was at stake in Hakata Bay, you must first understand what Kublai Khan was. By 1281, Kublai Khan ruled an empire so vast that the human mind genuinely struggled to comprehend it. His grandfather Genghis had shattered the old world. Kublai had rebuilt it, in his own image, on his own terms. He sat in his capital at Khanbalik, what we now call Beijing, surrounded by advisors from every culture his armies had conquered. Persian scholars, Chinese bureaucrats, European travelers like Marco Polo, who arrived at his court and could not find adequate words to describe what they saw. He was, in the medieval sense of the phrase, the most powerful man alive. Not metaphorically, literally. No other single human being in 1281 controlled more land, more people, or more military resources. And he wanted Japan. The reasoning was not purely about conquest for its own sake, though conquest was certainly part of it. Japan sat at the eastern edge of the sea lanes that connected China's vast wealth to the wider world. Japanese pirates, the Wako, had raided the Korean coast for generations, a persistent irritant that a man of Kublai's temperament found intolerable. More importantly, Kublai had declared himself the legitimate heir of Chinese civilization, the rightful emperor of the known world, and the stubborn little island nation to the east had responded to his demands of submission with something that might charitably be described as diplomatic silence, and was more accurately described as contempt. In 1268, Kublai's first formal diplomatic envoy arrived in Japan, bearing a letter. The letter's tone was not subtle. It described Kublai as ruling all under heaven and invited Japan to become a tributary state, acknowledging his supremacy. The alternative, the letter implied without quite stating, was obvious. Japan's imperial court in Kyoto read the letter with considerable alarm. The Kamakura shogunate, which held the actual military power in Japan, read the letter with considerably less alarm and considerably more fury. The letter was ignored. The envoys were sent home without an audience. More envoys came. In 1271, in 1272, in 1275. The Kamakura government's response escalated from silence to execution. The last two sets of envoys, arriving in 1275, were beheaded on the beach at Tatsuno-Kuchi. There are very few clearer ways to communicate to the world's most powerful warlord that you refuse to submit. Kublai Khan began preparing his first invasion. The man who would face that invasion and survive it to face the second was Hojo Tokimune, regent of the Kamakura shogunate. He was 20 years old when the first Mongol fleet appeared. 20. The weight that fell on those young shoulders was almost incomprehensible. The defense not just of his government, but of every man, woman, and child on the Japanese archipelago. The courtiers in Kyoto could pray. The Buddhist temples could pray. The Shinto shrines could pray. Tokimune's job was to ensure that prayers were supplemented by steel. His Zen master, Mugaku Sogen, described a young man who came to him in the early days of the crisis, trembling with what he described not as fear, but as something without a name, a cold thing in his chest that would not release. The master asked him where this nameless thing lived. Tokimune pointed to his belly. The master told him to bring it forward. And in the practice hall, in the deep silence before dawn, Tokimune opened his mouth and let out a sound, a roar, witnesses said, like a lion, and something in him changed. He was not fearless after that moment. Fearless men make careless mistakes. But he was resolved. And resolution in the world he had inherited was worth more than any weapon. The first invasion came in November 1274. A fleet of perhaps 900 ships carrying 30,000 warriors crossed the Korea Strait and struck the islands of Tsushima and Iki first, sentinel islands that guarded the approach to Kyushu. The defenders on those islands fought and died almost to the last man. What happened to them passed quickly into legend. Garrison commanders fighting alone against hundreds. Women throwing themselves into the sea rather than be captured. The stories spread south to Kyushu ahead of the fleet itself, carried by survivors and fishermen. And by the time the Mongol force landed at Hakata Bay, the samurai waiting on the shore already knew what manner of enemy they faced. What they discovered in that first battle redefined everything they thought they knew about war. The samurai tradition was built around individual combat. A warrior announced himself, named his lineage, called for a worthy opponent, and then fought that opponent in single combat, a ritual that had its roots in older, almost ceremonial warfare. The Mongols did not fight that way. They fought as a coordinated mass, moving in disciplined formations, responding to signals from drums and flags, advancing and retreating as a unified organism. When a samurai stepped forward to announce his name and lineage, the Mongols simply shot him with a massed arrow volley. When the Japanese cavalry charged, Mongol infantry locked shields and braced, while flanking riders loosed arrows from the sides. More terrifying than any of this, the weapons they had never encountered before. The tetsuhao, iron-cased bombs filled with gunpowder and iron fragments, hurled from catapults. They exploded in mid-air with a sound the Japanese chroniclers described as like thunder descending into a man's skull. Horses panicked. Warriors who had never known fear in individual combat found themselves paralyzed by an enemy that killed without face, without honor, from a distance, with noise and fire that seemed to come from nowhere. The psychological effect was profound and immediate. Japan's forces fell back on the first day at Hakata Bay. And then, on the night of November 19th, 1274, a storm struck the Korean Strait. The Mongol commanders, whose Korean navigators had been warning about the volatility of these waters in autumn, ordered the fleet to withdraw from shore to avoid being driven onto the beach. During that withdrawal, perhaps 200 ships were lost. The invasion force retreated to Korea. Japan had survived, barely, chaotically, against expectations. But everyone on both sides understood that the storm, not the samurai, had made the difference. Kublai Khan was not deterred. He was informed. He would come back. And next time, he would come with an army so large that no storm and no wall could stop it. The 7 years between the first and second invasions were among the most consequential in Japanese history. Tokimune ordered the construction of a stone defensive wall along Hakata Bay, 20 kilometers of barrier, up to 2 meters high and 3 meters wide, running along the shoreline to prevent another beachhead landing. Every lord in Kyushu was assessed for construction labor. Peasants worked alongside samurai retainers in conditions that killed some of them. The wall was completed by 1276. It was, in its way, the most ambitious engineering project Japan had ever undertaken. A monument not to glory, but to the cold calculus of survival. Tokimune also changed how Japan trained to fight. Samurai were instructed to abandon the challenge ritual. Group tactics were practiced. Archers were told to aim at the mass, not the man. It was a transformation that cut against 7 centuries of warrior tradition, and it did not come easily, and it was never fully complete. But it happened. Japan bent itself toward survival in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. In 1279, Kublai Khan completed his conquest of the southern Song dynasty, the last independent Chinese kingdom of any significance. That conquest gave him something invaluable for the next invasion: the Jiangnan fleet, the naval resources of China's southern coast, and the Chinese soldiers and sailors who had crewed it. He now had the capacity to launch not one fleet, but 2 simultaneously, a pincer that would overwhelm Japan's defenders from multiple directions before they could concentrate. He sent more envoys. Japan beheaded them again. In the spring of 1281, the 2 fleets set out. The shape of battle to come. The stone wall at Hakata Bay was, in military terms, a brilliant improvisation. It was also, in human terms, an act of collective will that still astonishes historians who study its construction. The wall was built under duress, under timeline pressure, under the oversight of men who had never built a coastal defense work and were learning as they went. The Kamakura shogunate issued construction orders in 1275, requiring the lords of northern Kyushu to provide labor proportional to their landholding. This was not a request. Lords who failed to contribute adequately faced consequences that were made explicit and were not abstract. And so the labor came. Samurai retainers who resented working with their hands, peasant farmers pulled from fields that needed tending, craftsmen more accustomed to building temples than military fortifications. They worked in the summer heat and the autumn rain. Some of them died of exhaustion and disease before the wall was finished. Their names went unrecorded. What they built was 20 kilometers of dressed stone, fitted without mortar in the Japanese tradition, rising 2 meters above the high tide line and extending in some sections 3 meters back from the waterline. The construction was not uniform. The sections built by different lords showed different levels of care and craftsmanship. Some sections tight-fitted and solid, others more loosely assembled, a stone record of the uneven commitment of those who built it. But it was complete. And completion, in a situation where the alternative was nothing, was everything. Any large vessel approaching the shore faced a choice: stay in water deep enough to float in, which meant staying far from the beach where the wall now stood, or press toward the shallows and risk running aground. The wall had been sited precisely at the boundary between those two zones, close enough to shore that defenders could reach it quickly, close enough to the waterline that attackers would have to wade through surf to reach it. A man wading through thigh-deep water, wearing armor, under arrow fire, facing defenders standing on stone, is not a man in a tactically advantageous position. But walls have limits. A wall stops a frontal assault. It does not stop flanking movements by sea. It does not stop a determined enemy from finding beaches to either side where the wall did not reach. And it certainly does not stop 4,500 ships from mounting assaults in so many places simultaneously that the defenders cannot be everywhere at once. Tokimune and his commanders knew this. The wall was a force multiplier, not a guarantee. It made the Japanese position stronger. It did not make it safe. The Eastern Route Army arrived first in the late spring of 1281, approximately 40,000 warriors on 900 ships, the reconstituted force from Korea, reinforced with Mongol cavalry and veterans of the 1274 invasion. Their commander was Holden, a Mongol general who had fought across Central Asia and understood the violence of amphibious landings. They struck first at Tsushima and Iki as before, and as before, the island garrisons fought and fell. But this time, the survivors brought news of a difference. The Eastern Route Army was not waiting for the Jiangnan force to join them. They were pressing directly toward Kyushu. The Jiangnan army was larger, 100,000 men, 3,600 ships, the vast military resource of conquered southern China mobilized in a single terrible fleet. Its commanders were primarily Chinese, men who had served the Song dynasty and now served its conqueror. A transition that pleased no one, and everyone had simply accepted. The fleet was delayed. It was supposed to rendezvous with the Eastern Route Army at Iki Island by a fixed date, and it was late. The reasons were logistical. So many ships, so many men, supply trains that stretched across the East China Sea. But the delay would matter. The samurai force defending Kyushu was smaller than anyone wanted. perhaps 10,000 warriors drawn from the lords of northern Kyushu, supplemented by warrior monks from the great temples, who had their own reasons to resist the coming of a foreign Buddhist emperor, who had already subordinated the Tibetan clergy to his will. Their weapons were the weapons of their tradition. The tachi, a curved longsword worn at the hip, longer and heavier than the later katana, and designed for use on horseback. The naginata, a curved blade mounted on a long pole, devastatingly effective against cavalry. The yumi, the asymmetric Japanese longbow, a weapon of exceptional power and precision that took years of daily practice to master. The yumi deserves particular attention in this context. Unlike the short recurve bows that Mongol cavalry had used to devastating effect across Central Asia, powerful weapons optimized for shooting from horseback in open terrain, the Japanese longbow was a weapon of precision at distance. A trained samurai archer could put an arrow through a gap in armor at 100 meters. At 50 meters, in the hands of a master, the shot was not aimed at a gap. It was aimed at a point. The Mongol cavalry had no horses here. They were men aboard ships, then men in boats, then men wading through chest-deep surf. Against a fixed defensive line held by archers who had trained since childhood and who were shooting from an elevated position at close range, the advantage the Mongol bow had delivered on the steppe plains did not translate. The water had taken away the horse, and without the horse, the Mongol archer was simply a man with a bow among thousands of other men with bows. That equation did not make the defense easy. But it made it possible, and the men themselves, every one of them a professional warrior, descended from professional warriors, trained in the specific and ancient arts of killing. They had one other thing: the wall. When the Eastern Route Army appeared off Hakata Bay in late May or early June of 1281, they found the stone barrier waiting. Their initial landing attempts were repulsed. The Mongol commanders tried to force their way ashore at multiple points along the bay simultaneously, spreading the defenders thin. But Tokimune's men had anticipated this, and the wall allowed a small force to hold a long line. The samurai defenders stood on stone, shot into the surf, and held. What followed was not a pitched battle in the traditional sense. It was a siege conducted on water. The Eastern Route Army, unable to establish a proper beachhead, anchored offshore and waited for the Jiangnan force to arrive. Their ships, designed for the crossing, not for extended habitation, became floating prisons. Men slept in holds. Fresh water ran short. The summer heat of the Japan Sea, amplified by the steel of armor and the press of bodies, turned the ships into sweat-soaked, disease-breeding enclosures. Dysentery spread. Wounds from the landing attempts went septic in the humidity. On the shore, the Japanese watched and waited and made their own calculations. It was on one of those waiting nights — the historical sources do not give us a precise date, only the texture of the season — that a young samurai retainer sat at the base of the stone wall and, by the light of a small lantern, composed a waka poem on a strip of wood. The poem was short, as the form demanded. It spoke of the harvest moon hidden behind clouds, of the sound of waves that had no knowledge of war, of a mother's face remembered from a great distance. He folded the strip of wood into the sleeve of his armor when he was finished. He did not know if he would survive to bring it home, or if it would be found on his body. He prayed at the small portable shrine his unit carried, a few words to the local kami, the spirit of the land itself. And then he slept, briefly and badly, with the sound of the enemy fleet breathing at him across the dark water. He was not a commander. He was not famous. He left no other record. But he was there that night, and 10,000 men like him were there that night. And their existence is the thing the historians sometimes forget when they narrate the movements of fleets and the decisions of generals. The priests at the great shrines of Ise, Izumo, and Usa conducted continuous ritual prayer throughout this period. Monks chanted sutras around the clock in the great temples of Kamakura and Nara. The emperor in Kyoto, who wielded spiritual authority even while the shogunate held military power, personally appealed to the shrines for divine protection. A nation in genuine fear, expressing that fear in the idiom available to it. Prayer, ritual, the invocation of powers larger than any army. And the sky, across August, was changing. The birds knew first. The older fishermen noticed that certain species had moved inland 2 weeks early. The color of the evening sky shifted, a greenish cast, a bruised quality to the clouds on the southern horizon, the kind of sky that the Korean navigators aboard the Mongol fleet recognized and feared. The wind had been steady from the southwest for days. Then it began to back, shifting toward the south and then the southeast. The pressure dropped in a way that made ears pop and that made old men's joints ache with a specific, prophetic pain. In the Mongol commander's councils aboard the fleet, the Korean navigators spoke urgently. The season was wrong. The omens were wrong. The fleet should move to deeper water, to shelter, to anywhere but a coastline during what was coming. But the armies were not loaded. The beachhead was not secured. The Jiangnan force had finally arrived, joining the Eastern Route Army in a combined fleet of over 4,000 ships, and the commanders had spent weeks preparing a coordinated assault. To abandon that preparation and run for the open sea meant losing weeks more. They waited 1 day too long. Fire, storm, and the divine wind. Phase 1. The Night Raids. The decision was Tokimune's, and it was made in the hour before midnight on what was probably the 14th of August, 1281, though the exact date remains contested across different sources. It was made not from a position of tactical confidence, but from the cold logic of a man who had assessed his situation and found only one option worth taking. The combined Mongol fleet now held perhaps 140,000 men. His own force numbered a fraction of that. Every day the enemy spent at anchor was a day their navy rested, their soldiers recovered, their supply lines consolidated. Every day that passed brought them closer to the moment when they would finally, decisively, come ashore in strength sufficient to overwhelm the wall and the men behind it. Waiting was losing. Slowly, incrementally, certainly, waiting was losing. So Tokimune sent the samurai to the ships. Not all of them. Small parties in small boats. the kinds of shallow draft craft that the samurai of Kyushu used for fishing and coastal movement. Vessels that could navigate waters the deep-hulled Mongol transports could not reach. A dozen men in a boat, perhaps 20, armed with fire. The order went out as the moon set. The bay went dark. And in that darkness, the boats pushed off from shore. The Mongol fleet was large enough that its nighttime watch was spread thin. Thousands of ships meant thousands of hull lengths of perimeter, each vessel connected to the next by anchor cables and the press of the anchorage, each one presenting a wall of timber above the waterline. The samurai raiders did not attempt to climb and board. They were too few for that. Instead, they came close alongside and threw bundles of burning material: oil-soaked straw, pitch-coated wood, anything that would catch and hold a flame. Wood caught. The first fire started on the eastern edge of the anchorage. By the time it was spotted, it had spread to 3 vessels. The ships were to close together for the fire to remain contained. The cables connecting them became its pathways, and the wind that had been building for 2 days carried sparks across 20 meters of water to the next vessel in line. Men aboard the burning ships had no real choice. They could fight the fire or they could jump, and many of them did both, and neither worked very well. The sound that reached the shore was unlike anything the defenders had heard before. It was not the disciplined roar of an army in formation. It was the chaos sound, 1,000 separate voices, 100 separate crises, the creak and shriek of timber under impossible heat, and beneath all of it, the continuous drum-rolling crash of the swells that had been building since sunset, already heavier than they had been at dawn, already carrying a weight that had no name yet, but would acquire one before the night was out. But the samurai raiders were not escaping cleanly. The Mongol fleet recovered faster than anyone had reason to expect. Within minutes of the first fire, guard boats were in the water, drums were beating the alarm pattern, and archers on undamaged ships were loosing arrows into the darkness toward anything that moved on the water. Several samurai boats were caught. The men aboard them were killed. A few were captured, dragged up onto the decks of Mongol ships, and questioned through Korean translators who had learned enough Japanese to extract information. What the prisoners said, or what they refused to say, went unrecorded. Their names went unrecorded. They were warriors who died in the dark, doing their commander's work, and the darkness kept their secret. By dawn, perhaps 30 Mongol ships were burning or had burned to the waterline. Against 4,500 vessels, this was a wound, not a wound that bled. But fire had touched the fleet. Fear had touched the fleet. And the sky to the south, as the sun rose on August 15th, had turned a color that the Korean pilots described to their commanders with an expression that translated, approximately, as the color of a bruise that goes all the way down. Phase 2. The Grinding Shore. The morning of August 15th brought the combined fleet's most serious attempt yet to force a landing. The Mongols had studied the wall during their weeks at anchor. They had identified its weaknesses, sections where the stone was thinner, places where the beach widened and the approaches were less exposed, points on the eastern and western flanks where the wall ended and the terrain opened. Their plan, worked out in the command councils aboard the flagship, was to strike simultaneously at multiple points with enough force to prevent the defenders from concentrating. Pure arithmetic. One wall held by 10,000 men against 20 attacks is a wall held at 500 men per attack, and 500 men, no matter how skilled, cannot hold indefinitely against 5,000. The assault boats went in at mid-morning. Flat-bottomed landing craft designed in Korea for precisely this purpose, each holding 100 soldiers. They came in on a broad front, and the wall's defenders poured arrows into them from the moment they came within range. The sound was extraordinary. Japanese longbows, the yumi, are not the short recurves of the steppe. They are asymmetric weapons nearly as tall as a man, drawing weights of 80 pounds or more, capable of driving an arrow through armor at ranges that still surprised contemporary observers from other traditions. At 50 meters, a massed volley from trained archers was not a hail of arrows. It was a wall of death arriving at chest height. The first wave of boats lost men before they touched the bottom. Men dropped into the surf and fell. Men in the second rank stepped forward over the bodies of the first rank and also fell. The water at the base of the wall turned colors, but the Mongols came on. That was the truth of the Mongol army that Japan had learned in 1274 and learned again now. They absorbed losses that would have broken most armies and continued to advance. Behind the individual soldiers was a command structure, a signal network, an organizational logic that processed casualties and fed replacements forward with cold efficiency. Soldiers died. The assault continued. The Tetsuhou came next. Cast-iron spheres, hollow, filled with gunpowder and packed iron fragments, with a fuse protruding from a hole at the top. The catapults on the larger vessels launched them in high arcs, and they came down on the defenders with a sound and a force for which nothing in Japanese military experience had prepared anyone. The ground shook. Men who were not hit by fragments were knocked from their feet by the concussive wave. Horses screamed. The smoke that came from the detonations was dense and foul, a chemical smell that had no name in Japanese, but that the body recognized as wrong in some primal pre-linguistic way. Samurai way. Samurai who had stood unmoved against sword and spear found their hands shaking. They held anyway. They held because they had been told to hold, and because behind them was their country, and because the man to the left and the man to the right was holding. And that logic, not abstract courage, but the very human unwillingness to be the one who breaks, is what has held defensive lines together in every era of recorded war. The wall held that morning. It bled, but it held. By afternoon, the wind had increased. The assault boats were now working against a chop that made the rowing harder and the aim less certain. A Mongol catapult crew, working on a vessel that had begun to roll in the swells, misjudged their trajectory and landed a Tetsuhou short of the wall, among their own wading infantry. The sound of it, and the screaming that followed, carried clearly to the Japanese defenders. No one on the shore celebrated. They were too tired and too frightened for celebration. But they noted it. Tokimune, watching from an elevated position behind the wall, understood what he was seeing. The weather was doing work that his soldiers could not. Every hour of the worsening sea was an hour of attrition for the enemy fleet. Harder to maneuver, harder to supply, harder to coordinate. He did not know, in that moment, the full dimension of what was coming from the south. But he knew enough. He ordered his men to hold and to rest in rotation. What they needed now was not valor. It was endurance. Phase 3. The stalemate. For 2 weeks, perhaps a bit less, perhaps a bit more, the sources disagree. The battle at Hakata Bay was neither victory nor defeat for anyone. The Mongols could not break the wall. The Japanese could not destroy the fleet. A balance had been struck between the size and power of the attacking force and the strength of the defensive position, and that balance held across days that blurred into each other under the summer heat and the building atmospheric pressure every man on both sides could feel accumulating in the air like a charge. On the ships, conditions were deteriorating beyond the tactical. Weeks at anchor in summer water with insufficient ventilation meant that disease was taking more men than the Japanese arrows and fire had taken combined. Dysentery was endemic. A fever of uncertain origin, possibly carried from the Chinese port cities where the Jiangnan fleet had assembled, was moving through the crowded holds. The commander's reports to Kublai Khan, had they been sent with full honesty, would have contained more entries about illness than about combat. The Japanese had their own problems. Resupply. Resupply from the interior of Kyushu was manageable, but the physical toll on the defenders was severe. Weeks of high alert, interrupted sleep, the constant stress of living under bombardment, combined with summer heat behind a stone wall that absorbed and radiated the sun's energy. Men lost weight. Men developed infections from minor wounds. Men who had been sleeping 4 hours in 36 had the particular hollow look of soldiers whose bodies are running on emergency reserves. But they were on their own land. They could be rotated. Fresh warriors could be brought forward from reserve positions. The Mongols, anchored offshore, could not be reinforced or relieved. The math, if it stayed only about attrition, favored Japan. But it could change at any moment if the Mongols breached the wall in force, and both sides knew it. It was during this period that the most famous single act of samurai valor in the 1281 invasion occurred. The historical record is incomplete and partially legendary, but the core appears to be real. A small party of samurai warriors, perhaps as few as 10 men, conducted a direct raid on what they believed to be the Mongol flagship. They navigated to it under darkness, boarded it by climbing anchor chains, nad in every version of the story. Most of them died. A few made it back to shore. The raid, whatever its actual military effect, spread through the Japanese defensive lines as a story of what 10 men, with enough conviction, could do against 40,000. The story was not propaganda. The men who heard it needed to believe it, and believing it, they held the wall another day. The sky on the evening of August 15th was a color that had no precedent in the records of the Hakata Bay fishing community. Green, several accounts say. A sickly green that appears only when sunlight is filtered through clouds so thick and so loaded with water that the light bends in ways it should not. The Korean navigators had been warning for 3 days. They warned again that evening. The commanders faced an impossible choice: disperse the fleet to deep water and loose all momentum, or hold and trust that the weather would pass. They held. 1 day too long. Phase 4. The Kamikaze. It came from the south before dawn on August 16th. Not all typhoons announce themselves with subtlety. This one, by every account that survived the night, did not. The wind shifted from the south-southeast to the south in the space of an hour, and then it stopped shifting and simply increased, steadily, continuously, without any of the normal fluctuations that even strong storms produce. The waves in the bay, which had been running 2 meters since evening, reached 3 meters, then 4, then lost their regular shape entirely and became a chaos of cross swells, walls of water coming from multiple directions at once, the bay itself confused and raging. The anchors began to drag. A single dragging anchor on a single ship in an open ocean is a manageable crisis. 4,500 ships dragging anchors simultaneously in a confined bay, each vessel threatening the ones around it, is not a crisis that has a management solution. The outer vessels in the anchorage were the first to go, driven by the wind onto the vessels inshore of them, the weight of a fully loaded transport ship moving at speed through broken water, being roughly equivalent to a battering ram of 300 tons. Ships. Ships that were struck did not simply lean, they broke. They split along their keel lines, the timber work that had been sufficient for the crossing, now unable to absorb the torsional forces being applied from 6 directions at once. And when a wooden ship breaks in water, it does not sink slowly and carefully. It comes apart. The holds flood in seconds. The men in the holds have seconds. On shore, the defenders could hear it before they could see it. The sound was a layered thing, the continuous roar of the wind, which had reached a pitch that was not quite sound anymore in the normal sense, but rather a physical pressure on the eardrums. Beneath that, the crash and grind of ships against ships, a noise like 1,000 carpenters' workshops simultaneously destroying themselves. And beneath that, barely audible, the sound of men in water. Then the light came, such as it was. The sky was a solid dark gray, no sun visible, just a general lightening of the murk. And the defenders on the shore saw what the bay had become. It was chaos on a scale that had no analogy in their experience. Ships were everywhere and nowhere. Vessels that had been anchored in orderly rows were now tumbling, capsizing, spinning. Masts came down. Hulls split open and spilled their contents, supplies, weapons, armored men, into water that was too violent to swim in. A man in full Japanese armor who went into that water died. A man in Mongol lamellar armor who went into that water died. The weight of protection that every warrior wore was the thing that killed him in the sea, and there was no time to remove it and no calm water to swim in, even if he had. The Mongol commanders who survived the storm described, in later accounts recorded by Chinese chroniclers, a night of absolute helplessness. One general wrote that he had stood on the deck of his vessel holding a rope attached to the mast and watched a ship 50 meters away roll completely over, men falling from the deck like drops of water from a shaken cloth, and then not surface. He had no words for the sound, he wrote. He had no frame for the scale. On the shore, the samurai watched in silence. There are accounts of men weeping, not with grief, but with something that had no easy name, a release of weeks of accumulated terror, now converting into something that felt like the intervention of forces outside human reckoning. The priests among them dropped to their knees where they stood. They had been praying for precisely this. The Shinto tradition understood the world as inhabited by kami, spirits that moved through the natural world, and the wind destroying the Mongol fleet in this moment matched the prayers exactly. It was not a gentle wind of divine favor. It was a wind of divine violence, killing indiscriminately, distinguishing the just from the unjust only by which side of a stone wall they stood on. Kamikaze, the divine wind. The word existed before 1281, referring loosely to the winds at the sacred shrine at Ise. But on this morning, watching the Mongol fleet come apart in Hakata Bay, it acquired a new meaning. It became specific. It became historical. It became the name for what happens when heaven itself takes sides. The storm lasted 2 days in its most violent phase, with residual winds and dangerous seas for several days after. When it finally abated and the bay returned to something resembling normality, the scale of the destruction became visible. Ships were beached on every shore of the bay. Some had been driven 30 kilometers from their anchorage position. The water was full of debris, timber, provisions, bodies, in quantities that would take weeks to fully wash up on shore. Of the 4,500 ships, estimates suggest that perhaps 200 survived the storm in condition to sail. The rest were sunk, driven aground, destroyed, or so damaged as to be unseaworthy. Of the 140,000 men who had comprised the invasion force, the numbers of survivors who made it back to the Asian mainland are counted in the thousands. It was, by any measure, one of the most complete military catastrophes in recorded history. Phase 5. The Reckoning on Shore. Not all of the Mongol force died in the storm. Perhaps 15,000 to 30,000 men survived the sinking of their ships and reached the shore of Takashima Island. They arrived without weapons, without armor, without food, without formation. They were men, just men. Cold, wet, terrified men on a beach. The samurai came for them. Tokimune's orders were as clean as they were merciless. The invasion force was to be eliminated. Japan could not afford to let even 10,000 Mongol veterans reorganize and attempt another assault. The decision was militarily rational and humanly terrible, and Tokimune made it without hesitation, which tells you something about the kind of man 7 years of crisis management had built. The samurai moved through the survivors over several days. It was not a battle. It was a series of violent encounters between armed, organized warriors and unarmed, exhausted men. Some fought back. Some ran. Some simply stood and waited. A small number were taken prisoner, among them Chinese soldiers conscripted from the conquered South, men with no loyalty to the dynasty they'd served. A handful were kept alive because their accounts of what the typhoon looked like from inside the fleet were of interest to the commanders and priests already beginning the work of interpretation. Those accounts survived. Fragmentarily, filtered through translation and deliberate shaping, but they survived. They are part of why we know what we know. The bay itself, in the days after the storm, was covered, horizon to horizon, with the wreckage of the greatest fleet the medieval world had ever assembled. Timber, rigging, provisions, documents, silks meant as tribute for lords who would never submit. All of it floating, shifting with the tidal current toward shore. The bodies came with it. The Reckoning. The counting of the dead at Hakata Bay in the late summer of 1281 was a task that no one completed to any satisfying degree of accuracy, because the scale of the losses exceeded the administrative capacity of anyone present to measure them. The Japanese sources suggest losses of between 60,000 and 100,000 Mongol dead, the vast majority drowned in the storm, with the remainder killed in the fighting on Takashima. Modern historians, working from a combination of the Japanese records, the Chinese chronicles that recorded the fleet's departure, and the much smaller number of its return, and the logistical records of the Korean shipyards that built the Eastern Route Army's vessels, tend toward the higher end of these estimates. Some scholars suggest that the true figure may have approached 120,000 dead. Men who crossed the Korea Strait in the spring of 1281 and never returned. The Korean peninsula felt the loss in ways that went beyond the military. The ships of the Eastern Route Army had been built by Korean craftsmen and crewed in significant part by Korean sailors, men whose kingdom had already been subjugated by the Mongols and who had been given no meaningful choice about participation. Of the 40,000 soldiers and sailors of the Eastern Route Army, the survivors who made it back to Korea were counted in the hundreds. Families on the Korean coast waited through the autumn of 1281 for ships that did not come back, and eventually stopped waiting. And that particular kind of grief, the grief of no body and no confirmation, only the sea's silence, settled into the coastal communities for a generation. Of the commanders, Liu Fuheng, the senior Chinese admiral of the Jiangnan fleet, drowned when his flagship broke apart in the storm's first hours. The accounts that place his death aboard the vessel are specific enough to have credibility. A witness described the ship rolling and Liu Fuheng grabbing the mast rail, and then the mast going, and Liu Fuheng going with it. He had commanded the largest Chinese naval force ever assembled to that date. He died in 15 meters of water, 2 kilometers from a shore he had never reached. Hold On, the Mongol general commanding the Eastern Route Army, survived. He rode out the storm on one of the deeper-hulled command vessels that the typhoon battered but did not sink, and he made the crossing back to Korea on what remained of the fleet. He returned to Kublai Khan's court and reported what had happened, that the storm had done what the samurai had not quite managed, that heaven itself had intervened in a fashion that no general could plan against. Kublai Khan did not execute him. Given the scale of the catastrophe, this restraint itself tells you something about how completely the disaster transcended individual accountability. On the Japanese shore, the immediate aftermath was quieter than anyone expected. Tokimune did not celebrate. The accounts of him in the days immediately following the storm describe a man who spent considerable time in temple and shrine, in prayer and ritual purification, in the specific posture of a person who has been given a gift he did not entirely earn, and who is not sure what the obligation that comes with such a gift amounts to. He was 26 years old. He had defended Japan twice from the greatest military empire the world had yet produced. He had done it with walls and warriors and small boat raids by night, and with a storm that no human commander had summoned. The battlefield, in those weeks after the storm, was an extraordinary thing to move through. The sea wall, battered by the typhoon's winds and the crash of debris against its face, had held. Behind it, the defenders had sustained losses. No one kept exact records in the chaos, but estimates run to perhaps 3,000 samurai dead across the entire campaign, a fraction of what the attackers had lost. In front of the wall, the beach was covered with the residue of the invasion: weapons, provisions, the personal effects of men who would never collect them. Bodies had been buried or burned where possible. Where not possible, they had simply been covered with sand. The sea continued to give up its dead for weeks. Fishing boats working the bay found men floating in armor, preserved in their final postures by the weight of steel that had killed them. Some were recovered and given such burial as could be managed. Most were not. The ocean kept them. Kublai Khan, receiving the news at his court in Khan Balik, responded in the manner of a man who absolutely could not accept the conclusion that the outcome demanded. He launched planning for a third invasion almost immediately. New fleets would be built. New conscription orders would be issued. Japan would be brought to heel. The planning continued for years. 1283, 1284, 1285, the administrative record shows orders and counter-orders, ship construction contracts, supply assessments. And then, in 1294, Kublai Khan died. His successor had other priorities. The third invasion never came. Japan would not face another existential external threat for more than 650 years, until August 1945, when American aircraft arrived over Hiroshima with something that made even the Tetsuhou seem gentle: the wind that never died. What Hakata Bay created was not just a military victory. It created a theology. The concept of the Kamikaze, the divine wind, existed before 1281, as noted, in the vocabulary of the Ise shrine tradition. But after 1281, it became something foundational to the Japanese understanding of their own place in the world. Japan was not merely an island nation that had defended itself successfully against a superior force. Japan was an island nation that heaven had chosen to protect. The kami, the spirits of the land, the sea, the storm, had intervened directly and visibly in human history on Japan's behalf. This was not interpretation or metaphor. To the people who lived through it, and to the generations that inherited their testimony, it was simply what had happened. The implications were enormous. An island that heaven protects has a special status in the cosmic order. not merely a nation among nations, but something set apart. This belief settled into Japanese culture at a deep level, informing the political theology of the imperial institution and the everyday cultural assumption of Japanese uniqueness that persists in modified forms into the present. It was a belief built on real events. The storm happened. The fleet was destroyed. The numbers were real. But the interpretation layered onto those real events, the cosmic favoritism, the special divine protection, would do tremendous damage 6.5 centuries later, when Japanese military planners in 1944, facing the most powerful navy the world had ever assembled, reached back to 1281 and gave that name to their pilots. Young men strapping themselves into aircraft loaded with explosives, flying them into American warships as the wind made flesh. The ideology that had grown from a genuine meteorological catastrophe became the justification for asking human beings to become the storm. Tokimune would not have recognized what his victory created. He died in 1284 at the age of 29 in the Engakuji temple he had founded in Kamakura to honor the dead of both invasions, Japanese and Mongol alike. The gesture was characteristic. A man who had spent his adult life in the business of killing without losing the capacity to recognize that the men on the other side of the wall were also men. He is venerated in Japan to this day. The temple he built still stands in Kamakura. You can visit it. The stone seawall at Hakata, the 20 kilometers of barrier that held back 40,000 warriors, is mostly gone now, eroded by centuries of tidal action and covered by the expansion of the city of Fukuoka that now sits on the bay's southern shore. Sections have been excavated and are on display. You can put your hand on stones that samurai archers stood behind, stones that Mongol soldiers waded through surf to reach, stones that held a line that history turned on. And in the waters off Takashima Island, beneath 15 meters of silt and salt water, the storm's victims are still there. In 2011, exactly 730 years after the typhoon, archaeologists working off Takashima recovered the remains of a Mongol warship. Around it, anchors, weapons, pottery, the personal effects of soldiers. A helmet, lacquered in the Chinese fashion, perfectly preserved by the silt. Human bones. And a bronze seal bearing an inscription that identified the officer whose ship this had been. A man who died in the storm and whose name had been lost, found again in the mud of the bay where heaven's wind had put him. The sea gives up its secrets slowly, but it gives them up. Centuries later, a diver descends through green water toward a silted bottom, and the light fades, and the sounds of the surface world disappear. And somewhere below is a ship that carried men from the steppes, the plains of China, and the shores of Korea into the most lethal piece of weather the medieval Pacific could produce. The diver's light catches the edge of something, a curve of lacquered bronze, too perfect to be natural, too old to be recent. The divine wind blew once. The divers are still finding the bodies it made.